The first light of dawn stretched across the frozen plains with a hesitancy, as if the sun itself were reluctant to pierce the vast, quiet whiteness. The horizon shimmered faintly, a soft gradient of pink melting into muted blues, as though the sky itself were a fragile sheet of ice slowly thawing. The snow underfoot, crisp and unbroken, reflected this gentle illumination, sparkling like countless tiny diamonds scattered by a meticulous hand. Each flake seemed to hold a memory frozen mid-flight from some distant storm long past. The world felt still, yet alive in a quiet, deliberate rhythm. The faint sighing of wind over ridges, the distant groan of shifting ice, the subtle cracking of frost-laden stones as they warmed against the touch of early sunlight. A lone figure moved across this expanse, wrapped in furs that rustled softly with every careful step. The cold bit at exposed skin with a persistent, sharp insistence, and each inhalation sent a thin cloud of white into the air. The traveler paused, head tilted slightly toward the rising light, noticing the subtle textures in the ice, how it collected on the edges of rocks in tiny crystalline feathers, how the surface of the snow held the impression of a wind's passing, curving and folding like the undulations of a frozen sea. Even in this emptiness, there was sound, the soft grinding of snow beneath boots, the faint echo of distant ice cliffs shifting imperceptibly, and the occasional crack of a distant branch under frost's weight. The figure's eyes lingered on a distant ridge, where the snow formed gentle dunes, their peaks kissed by the pale sun. The mind wandered, tracing the contours, imagining the seasons they had endured, how summer's fleeting warmth had softened the hard crust, how autumn winds had swept loose snow into drifts, and how winter had finally claimed the land in its full, silvery quiet. Thoughts meandered slowly, like the wind itself. What lives had passed over this ground? Which footsteps had been erased by snow, leaving only silence behind? The frost held stories, whispered to those who paused long enough to listen. The traveler knelt and brushed a gloved hand over the snow, feeling its powdery resistance, the crunching shift of frozen grains beneath fingers. Beneath the snow, the ground was firm, unyielding, a hidden layer of clay and stones pressed into patterns that centuries of frost had carved. The hand lingered, imagining the slow, deliberate erosion of the land by ice and wind, the silent sculpting that no human eyes had witnessed. Here, in the quiet, one could feel time stretching, folding over itself in layers, each season folding into the next, leaving traces visible only to those who moved with attention and care. The traveler's breath, steady and rhythmic, rose in thin plumes, drifting and fatting like small clouds in the pale morning. A thought lingered. The north was not empty. Life persisted here, often invisible, often careful, but persistent nonetheless. Beneath the snow, small mammals burrowed, insulated by the earth. Above, birds huddled in evergreens, wings tucked close to retain warmth. Occasionally, a distant cry would pierce the silence. A hawk, a raven, perhaps even a lone wolf. Each sound a reminder that the frozen world was alive, even when stillness seemed complete. A shallow stream wound through a nearby valley, its water not yet fully frozen. The edges sparkled with rime, delicate lacework etched by ice. The traveler knelt again, brushing aside snow to expose the dark, liquid flow. It moved slowly, meandering between stones smoothed by long years of thaw and freeze. The sound was faint, a soft gurgle, a gentle promise of life beneath the hard, frozen surface. Leaning closer, the traveler dipped a finger into the icy water, tasting it, a sharp, bracing chill that lingered on the tongue. It was nourishment and reminder. Even in the harshest places, water persisted, and with it, the possibility of life. The body moved with careful deliberation, each step considered against the uneven, glittering terrain. Furs shifted with the motion, beads of ice forming on edges, melting slightly under the faint warmth of the rising sun, only to refreeze in the crisp air. The traveler's gaze lingered on the play of light across ice, the way it caught on ridges and glimmered like frozen fire, the shadows cast long and soft, stretching across the snow with slow inevitability. Time itself seemed to slow here, measured not in hours but in small changes. The slight brightening of the sky, the subtle shift of wind, the gradual movement of clouds drifting like soft smoke across the horizon. Thoughts returned inward, wandering to the distant past. Perhaps generations had walked these plains before, faces etched with frost and determination, eyes scanning horizons for prey, for shelter, for signs of weather yet to come. The traveler imagined the careful observation, the quiet calculations, the rhythm of life dictated by seasons, by ice, by river. Each small act, kneeling, tasting water, feeling snow, watching clouds, was an echo of countless similar acts performed across centuries. Here continuity was tangible, carried in footprints, in river bends, in the slow sculpting of cliffs and ridges. A sudden gust of wind carried a sharper bite, forcing the traveler to pause, wrap furs closer and hunch slightly against it. Tiny snow crystals swirled in the air, catching the sunlight and scattering prisms across the snow like scattered stars. The wind moved through the ridges, over stones, across plains, carrying sound and cold alike. In the gust, the traveler heard the faint, distant call of an unseen creature and paused again, listening, breathing, feeling the pulse of life in the frozen world. Slowly the figure continued, each step a meditation. The plain stretched outward, vast and unbroken, dotted only by ice-streaked rocks and occasional drifts sculpted by wind. Eyes traced the horizon endlessly, seeking shapes, shadows, changes in the pale landscape. The rhythm of walking, of observing, of breathing, became almost hypnotic, step, glance, pause, inhale, each repetition reinforcing a sense of belonging in a world both harsh and astonishingly beautiful. By the time the sun had risen further, spreading wider pinks and pale golds across the snow, the traveler reached a small rise. Kneeling to rest, the gloved hands brushed against snow, ice, and a hint of frozen earth. Here the view expanded. Ice cliffs shimmered in the distance, wind carried soft drifts across valleys, and the river below twisted and turned like a frozen ribbon. It was a moment of quiet contemplation, a pause to feel the cold against skin, the weight of the furs, the texture of ice beneath fingertips, and the profound stillness of the north. Internal reflection lingered. The traveler's mind wandered along rivers, across ridges, through centuries of wind and snow. Life, though fragile, persisted. Seasons repeated their rhythm, and with them the stories of countless humans and animals. Each breath, each footstep, each glance at sparkling ice was a small part of a continuum, a reminder that even in the vastest emptiness there was order, there was rhythm, there was life. And so dawn slowly settled on the frozen plains, a pale, deliberate light spreading across ice and snow. The wind whispered, the river murmured, the snow sparkled, and the traveler moved forward, step by step, immersed in the quiet, eternal rhythm of a frozen world, aware of its beauty, its harshness, and its gentle, hypnotic pulse. The river wound its way through the frozen plains like a dark, serpentine ribbon, half hidden beneath a crust of ice that glimmered faintly in the weak morning light. Its surface was a mosaic of smooth, glassy stretches and brittle patches of frost, each fragment catching the sun and scattering it in muted flashes. Tiny waves lapped against the ice edges, sending soft, repetitive sounds that punctuated the silence, a quiet rhythm that seemed both ancient and eternal. The traveler approached slowly, boots crunching in the snow, the sound muted but persistent, each step a deliberate meditation on the delicate ground. The air carried the sharp tang of ice, the faint metallic scent of flowing water, and the crisp aroma of frozen earth, subtle yet present, filling the senses with a richness often overlooked in the vast emptiness of the north. Kneeling at the riverbank, the traveler brushed snow aside, revealing dark water that moved with a patient, unhurried current. A few chunks of ice floated lazily, carried downstream with quiet insistence, their edges glinting and refracting the weak sunlight like tiny, fractured mirrors. The traveler's gloved fingers hovered above the surface, watching as ripples formed and spread slowly, widening outward in gentle concentric circles. There was a hypnotic quality to this movement, a reminder that even in the frozen expanse, life persisted, water flowed, and time continued its steady, unyielding march. Bending closer, the traveler tasted the river, letting a single droplet touch the lips. The water was ice cold, yet fresh, bracing, and strangely comforting. It carried with it the memory of distant mountains, melted snow from high ridges, and the quiet passage of centuries. As the droplet slid down the throat, the traveler paused, eyes following the current as it twisted between ice-covered stones, observing how it moved around obstacles, unbothered, persistent. There was a lesson in the river's patience, a subtle teaching about endurance and the quiet persistence of life, even in landscapes that seemed otherwise desolate. The surrounding plain was a study in subtle sounds and textures. Frost-crusted reeds along the riverbank scraped softly in the wind, while distant cliffs emitted the occasional sharp creak or low rumble as ice shifted under the sun's early warmth. The traveler's ears caught every nuance, listening carefully, allowing each sound to become part of an intricate symphony of the frozen north. Even the snow beneath hands and knees revealed its secrets, fine, powdery layers overlaying denser ice, each crack or shift a tactile reminder of the land's slow, deliberate shaping. The traveler lingered over each detail, letting the fingers trace frozen patterns, imagining the hands that had pressed into this same snow generations before, the same rivers sipped, the same winds felt. The mind wandered with the water, imagining creatures that relied upon it. A hare cautiously approaching the edge to drink, the tracks of a fox etched into the thin snow nearby, birds dipping for frozen morsels that floated atop the current. All of them, invisible in many moments, left traces that demanded patient observation. The traveler's thoughts circled slowly. Life in the north was never hurried, never reckless. Every movement, every breath, every choice was measured, deliberate, and often dictated by the subtle cues of river, wind, and weather. To exist here required attention to detail, a gentle rhythm of observation and adaptation that mirrored the river's own steady flow. A soft wind picked up, sending tiny snowflakes spinning across the river's surface. They landed and melted instantly, leaving miniature rings in the flowing water, concentric echoes of passing moments. The traveler's eyes followed these patterns, tracing the repetition, noting the constancy of movement. The river, like life itself, was a constant but ever-changing, an endless rhythm of repetition and variation. One could stand at its edge for hours, observing, reflecting, learning the subtle language of water, ice, and sky. The traveler's gaze shifted to the far bank, where ice cliffs rose in jagged formations, their surfaces streaked with shadow and frost. Occasionally, a small piece of ice broke free, striking the river with a faint plunk, sending a tiny wave outward. Each sound echoed across the plains, magnified in the quiet, crystalline air. The traveler inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of wet stone and frozen wood, letting the cold enter the lungs fully, as though in communion with the river itself. In these moments, the boundary between self and landscape seemed to dissolve. The river was not separate, but part of a larger rhythm in which the traveler, the snow, and the wind all participated. Reaching into a small pouch, the traveler drew out a few seeds of dried berries collected in previous days. Holding them against the palm, fingers brushing over their wrinkled surfaces, there was a sensory meditation, the faint sweet scent, the weight, the subtle texture. Slowly they were eaten, one by one, a small act of sustenance that tied the traveler to both past and present. The river moved on, unchanging, indifferent yet reliable. Each small act, sipping water, tasting berries, brushing snow aside, was mirrored in the repetition of the river's current, each ripple echoing the simplicity and profundity of daily survival. The river, despite its calm surface, carried undercurrents, faint whispers of history. Ice shelves hinted at previous floods, stones smoothed by centuries of running water, occasional pieces of driftwood frozen into the bank. The traveler observed each detail, reflecting silently on time's vast scales. Human lifespans were brief, ephemeral against the enduring flow. Yet there was continuity here, patterns repeating across generations. The hunt, the crossing of rivers, the careful observation of water and ice, the quiet recording of signs in snow and stone. The river, in its subtle movements, reminded one that all things existed in cycles, connected by the invisible threads of nature's design. As the morning wore on, the sun climbed higher, scattering a pale warmth across the landscape. Light touched the water differently now, shimmering across ripples, glinting off ice shards, creating a subtle dance of reflections. The traveler leaned back, letting the cold melt slightly into the warmth of observation, savoring the stillness. There was a gentle rhythm to these hours. Observe, taste, feel, breathe, watch. A meditative cadence arose, hypnotic in its repetition, grounding the traveler in the moment and in the eternal pulse of the north. In the distance, a small herd of caribou approached the riverbank, moving with careful, deliberate steps. The traveler watched, still and silent, nodding the soft thud of hooves on snow, the clouds of warm breath rising against the chill, the way each animal maintained space yet moved as a collective. There was no rush. There was no panic. The rhythm of life unfolded as naturally as the river's current. Each detail, ear twitch, nose flick, eye glinting in morning light, was observed, appreciated, and woven into the quiet narrative of survival and continuity. The traveler's own reflection appeared briefly in the water, distorted and shimmering. The face, framed by furs, eyes narrowed against the sunlight, seemed both solitary and connected to everything else. Here, standing at the river's edge, life felt measured not by distance traveled but by attention given. To snow, to ice, to water, to wine, to the slow, deliberate unfolding of existence. In this silence there was understanding. Patience was not just a virtue, it was a necessity. Awareness, slow and steady, carried one through the cold, through the plains, through seasons yet to come. By midday, the traveler rose, brushing snow from knees and furs. The river continued its quiet journey, ripples spreading, ice shelves shifting imperceptibly, and small sounds of life echoed faintly across the plains. Each step back from the water's edge was deliberate, a slow parting, an acknowledgement of the lessons whispered by flowing water. The cold, the wind, the frozen earth, and the river itself were companions in a world that demanded observation, patience, and quiet wonder. As the traveler moved away, the river persisted, unchanged yet never the same, carrying its whispers across time and space. The water's rhythm echoed in memory, a gentle, hypnotic cadence that would accompany each step forward, each breath, each reflection. Here in the frozen north, the river was a teacher, a mirror, and a constant companion. And for those willing to slow, to linger, and to feel, it offered a subtle but profound understanding. Life, even in the harshest and coldest places, flows steadily, patiently, beautifully, in its own quiet, eternal rhythm. The snow stretched endlessly, a pristine canvas of white interrupted only by the faint impressions of life. Each footprint, each groove, each subtle depression was a message written in silence, a story etched into the frozen ground by creatures that had passed before. The traveler moved cautiously, eyes tracing the delicate patterns, letting the wind play across cheeks and ears, feeling the crisp bite of frost in each inhalation. The world seemed hushed, yet full of secrets, waiting for those patient enough to observe. The first tracks appeared near a small ridge, a cluster of tiny depressions, likely left by a hare. The snow around them was light, powdery, fragile, shifting softly with the slightest breeze. Kneeling, the traveler studied the shape of each print, the delicate curve of claw marks, the subtle indentation of paws pressing into snow. Fingers brushed lightly against the cold surface, feeling the granular resistance of frozen crystals and the brittle layering beneath. The mind lingered on the hair itself, imagining the small, cautious animal moving carefully, hopping lightly, pausing to sniff the air, alert to every sound, every shadow, every breath of wind. Nearby, larger tracks marred the otherwise unbroken snow. They were wider, heavier, likely a fox or a young wolf. The traveler's eyes followed the path, observing the spacing between steps, noting how the weight pressed the snow deeper at intervals. There was a rhythm here, a silent cadence, as if the creature's movements were measured and deliberate. The observer crouched lower, brushing snow aside to expose more detail, and felt a quiet kinship with these creatures. Survival in this frozen expanse required care, patience, and attentiveness, the same traits that guided the traveler across the plains. Time slowed in these moments. The traveler lingered over each impression, imagining the journey of the animals, where they had come from, what they had seen, what dangers they had evaded. The snow itself recorded the passage of hours of storms, of the faint pressure of wind shaping drifts over footprints. One could read not only movement but the story of the land, its subtle rises, the hidden hollows, the places where ice collected and melted, the edges of frozen rivers. The landscape was a text, and the traveler's attention was the key to reading it. As the figure continued, the footprints grew more complex. Some paths intersected, perhaps a fox passing beneath a distant ridge where a hare had paused, or a lone wolf circling through open snowfields. The traveler followed a set of tracks that meandered gently toward the river, nodding the careful, methodical steps. The soft, muffled crunch beneath boots became a companion to the mind's wandering thoughts. Here in this slow, deliberate observation, the rhythms of life, both animal and human, unfolded with clarity. Each step mirrored the next, a repeating motif of continuity, patience, and quiet endurance. The traveler knelt again to examine smaller details. Tiny indentations beside the tracks suggested a shifting of weight, a pause, a sniff of the wind. The snow showed subtle fractures where claws had scraped at the surface, revealing glimpses of darker earth beneath. Even the faintest evidence carried meaning, requiring the observer to slow the mind, to move with care, to imagine fully the life that had made it. It was a meditation. The repetitive tracing of prints, the careful placement of fingers in snow, the gentle inhalation of cold air, the repeated noticing of small, often overlooked details. A breeze swept across the plains, lifting light snowflakes into the air. They spun lazily, descending slowly in spirals and eddies, occasionally landing on fur or glove. The traveler paused, letting the flakes settle and melt, watching the ephemeral designs vanish instantly. There was a quiet reflection in this, a reminder that nothing in this frozen world was permanent. Even the deepest tracks pressed firmly into the snow would fade with time, erased by wind, snowfall, and sun. Life was fleeting, yet each small act, each footprint, each pause, each careful observation left its mark, however temporary, on the vast white canvas. The traveler's thoughts drifted inward, as they often did in these solitary hours. The North demanded patience, attentiveness, and reflection. Survival was not only physical but mental. The ability to read tracks, to interpret the whispers of wind and river, to feel the rhythms of animals and seasons, was as vital as the strength of limbs or the warmth of clothing. Each footprint in the snow carried lessons: the pace of movement, the rhythm of breathing, the weight of life in an unforgiving landscape. There was quiet wonder in this understanding, a deep respect for creatures who had survived and continued to survive through centuries of ice and storm. A small set of tracks caught the traveler's attention next, larger, irregular, and distinct from anything previously observed. Likely human, pressed carefully into the snow, perhaps by a traveling hunter or a passing clan. The prints were deliberate, measured, showing care in each step. The traveler crouched low, tracing the edges with gloved fingers, noting the spacing, imagining the hands and feet that had created them. What tools had they carried? What route had they followed? How had they navigated the same plains that stretched endlessly beneath the rising sun? There was a silent dialogue across time, a gentle connection with those who had come before, whose presence lingered only in these subtle impressions. Continuing along the snowy expanse, the traveler noticed overlapping prints, animals and humans crossing paths, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Each set told a story of interaction, of avoidance, of coexistence. The snow recorded the rhythm of life: predation, survival, migration, observation. There was no rush here, no urgency beyond the slow, steady pulse of existence. The traveler's mind followed each path, imagining creatures pausing to watch, humans scanning the horizon for danger or opportunity, all movements synchronized to the rhythms of wind, cold, and light. The sun climbed higher, scattering muted gold across the landscape. Shadows from ridges and scattered rocks elongated and contracted slowly, merging and dividing in quiet repetition. The traveler paused to rest, kneeling in the snow and letting gloved hands brush over tracks, feeling their depth, texture, and subtle irregularities. Inhaling deeply, the scent of frozen earth, drifting pine, and lingering ice filled the lungs, reinforcing the tactile connection to the land. Reflection deepened. Each footprint was an echo of persistence, a record of adaptation, a meditation on continuity amidst the stark beauty of the North. Even the smallest details demanded attention. A faint scrape beside a track suggested a shift in direction, a sudden pause, perhaps a reaction to a sound carried on the wind. Tiny holes in snow-covered ridges hinted at burrowing animals beneath the frost, moving in darkness, insulated from the chill, their lives unseen yet integral to the web of existence. The traveler observed, tracing connections between tracks, contemplating unseen lives, feeling a profound kinship with all creatures that navigated this frozen expanse with patience and care. Hours passed slowly, measured in subtle changes. Shadows moving across snow, ice slowly cracking and melting under the sun, distant cliffs catching new angles of light. The traveler's mind wandered through histories, the countless humans who had walked these plains, the animals that had survived alongside them, the slow accumulation of seasonal and annual patterns preserved in ice and snow. Each moment of observation became part of a larger rhythm, a hypnotic cadence reinforcing the continuity of life, the interconnectedness of all who had passed through these landscapes. Eventually, the traveler rose, brushing snow from knees and furs, and began to follow a path indicated by the tracks. Each step was deliberate, matching the slow, measured pace of the creatures whose traces had been studied. The rhythm of walking, observing, and reflecting became meditative, repeating gently like the river's flow, like the shifting of wind over snow, like the recurring patterns of sun and shadow. Life, in its quiet persistence, moved forward slowly, but inevitably across the frozen plains. In the afternoon, a gust of wind lifted a cloud of snow, spiraling across the tracks. The impressions remained visible for a moment, then softened, the edges blurred, and the story became subtler, almost hidden. The traveler paused, appreciating the transience of it all, the fleeting nature of life, yet the enduring lessons left behind. Every footprint, every scrape, every subtle depression in snow was both ephemeral and eternal, a momentary impression and a testament to life in the North. By evening, the sun dipped lower, scattering elongated shadows over the plains. The traveler, still following the path of tracks, felt a deep connection to the rhythms of this landscape. The snow whispered stories of creatures, humans, survival, and persistence. Step by step, observation by observation, breath by breath, the traveler became part of the quiet cadence of the frozen North, walking in time with the world itself, aware that every small detail, every track, every texture, every sound, was both a lesson and a meditation. The North, vast and silent, continued to teach through its tracks. Each mark in snow, whether animal or human, was a note in a slow, deliberate symphony. Observing, following, reflecting. This was survival, this was connection, this was understanding. And as the traveler moved forward, eyes tracing faint impressions fading into evening light, there was a quiet contentment, the awareness that life, though fragile and fleeting, persisted, that the North, though harsh and silent, was filled with stories waiting patiently for those willing to notice, to linger, and to reflect. The day had settled into a muted rhythm. The traveler's eyes scanned the horizon, noting the subtle rise and fall of snow-covered ridges, the faint shimmer of frost along jagged rocks, and the occasional dark shadow that hinted at distant wildlife. Movement here was slow and deliberate. Every gesture carried weight. Every sound traveled far across the frozen plains. There was a patient stillness in the air, a quiet anticipation, as though the land itself was waiting, observing, whispering secrets only perceptible to those attuned to its rhythms. A distant shape caught the traveler's attention. A small herd of reindeer moved across a ridge, their white and gray coats blending with the snow, making them difficult to discern against the muted backdrop. The traveler's breathing slowed, body lowering into a crouch, careful to distribute weight evenly to avoid unnecessary noise. The snow underfoot, though powdery in some areas, bore hidden crusts in others, and each step required thoughtful placement. Even the faintest disturbance could alert prey to presence, a subtle dance between hunter and hunted that had persisted for generations. The wind shifted, a soft whisper against the traveler's cheek, carrying scents that had traveled miles across the plains. The faint metallic tang of ice mingled with the earthy aroma of frozen soil and the dry, musky scent of distant animal fur. The traveler inhaled carefully, letting the air pass slowly through the nostrils, observing how the wind might betray movement or mask it. In this environment, survival depended not only on strength or speed, but on observation, patience, and a profound understanding of nature's nuances. The herd moved with a rhythm both familiar and mesmerizing. Each step was deliberate, hooves pressing into snow, leaving tracks that the traveler traced in quiet contemplation. The occasional shift in posture, a flick of the ear, a glance toward the horizon, suggested awareness, caution, and alertness. The traveler noted each gesture, committing patterns to memory, understanding the herd's careful negotiation of the harsh terrain. Every movement, however subtle, was a lesson in endurance and grace within a landscape that allowed no carelessness. Crouched behind a low rise, the traveler adjusted a simple hunting tool, a spear carefully carved from wood, its tip hardened and polished. Fingers traced the smooth surface, knotting faint grooves left by the hand that had shaped it. The tactile sensation was grounding, connecting past and present, a ritual repeated across generations of hunters who had walked these plains. Each tool was an extension of the body, a means of survival, a link to ancestors who had once navigated the same snow, studied the same tracks, and felt the same cold bite of wind against bare skin. Time stretched in this quiet waiting. The traveler's thoughts wandered, a meditation punctuated by the subtle rhythm of wind over snow, the distant calls of birds, and the soft murmuring of a partially frozen stream nearby. The mind reflected on the fragility and persistence of life, the reindeer moving in herds for protection, the wolf stalking unseen, the small mammals burrowing beneath snowdrifts. Life here was a delicate balance, measured not in minutes but in patterns, attention, and the gentle unfolding of hours. The reindeer moved closer to a narrow valley, where the snow was softer and the terrain offered subtle cover for the traveler. Muscles coiled, senses sharpened, body attuned to the rhythm of the herd. The wind shifted once more, and the traveler adjusted position, careful to remain downwind, invisible. There was a heightened awareness of every detail, the way snowflakes melted on fur, the sound of hooves pressing against the crust, the subtle tilt of heads as ears twitched toward the distant horizon. Every small observation mattered, forming a narrative of anticipation and understanding that could mean the difference between success and failure. As the distance closed, the traveler reflected on the history of hunting in these frozen lands. Generations had depended on careful observation, patience, and deep knowledge of animal behavior. Prey was never simply pursued. It was studied, understood, and approached with respect. The tools were extensions of skill, crafted with care and honed over time, and each hunt was an exercise in mindfulness, endurance, and an intimate connection to the landscape. The wind, the snow, the river, the ridges, all were participants in this slow, deliberate ritual. The first strike was measured. The traveler waited until the herd reached a shallow dip in the valley, where visibility was clear yet cover remained. The spear was raised, steady in gloved hands, eyes locked on the target. In that moment, all sound, movement, and thought coalesced into a singular focus. The distant murmur of wind, the soft rustle of fur against snow, and the faint cracking of ice underfoot became part of the hunter's internal rhythm. Breath was controlled, slow, deliberate, merging with the quiet cadence of the frozen world itself. But the hunt was not only about action, it was about observation, respect, and reflection. The traveler paused, watching the herd shift, noting the strength and coordination of each animal. There was a recognition of intelligence, awareness, and resilience, a quiet admiration for those who shared this harsh land. Even in anticipation of survival, there was a pause for wonder. For the way light glimmered across fur, for the rhythmic stamping of hooves, for the wind carrying whispers of distant forests, rivers, and mountains. A single reindeer moved slightly apart from the herd, cautious yet unaware of the observer's presence. The traveler adjusted stance, careful not to disturb the snow, muscles tense but controlled. The rhythm of approach was deliberate. Step, pause, breathe, observe. Each movement echoed the patterns of countless hunters who had walked these plains, tracing their prey with patience, humility, and profound awareness. In these frozen lands, the hunt was not merely survival. It was a meditation on connection, timing, and the deep, steady pulse of life. As the reindeer grazed, the traveler reflected inwardly on the cycle of sustenance and gratitude. The hunt was a necessity, but it carried responsibility. Each life taken fed not only body but community, ensuring continuity across generations. The cold, harsh world demanded respect, careful attention, and acknowledgement of interdependence. The rhythm of hunting, slow and deliberate, mirrored the subtle repetitions of wind, river, and snow, reinforcing the hypnotic, patient cadence that governed survival in the north. Finally, the moment arrived. The spear was poised, eyes focused, and the movement was a seamless extension of hours of preparation and observation. The throw was precise, measured, and deliberate, following the patterns of wind, trajectory, and distance. The reindeer moved, adapting as all living creatures do, but the hunter had merged observation, patience, and skill into a singular, harmonious act. The result was swift, silent, and respectful, a moment in which life, death, and survival intersected quietly amidst the frozen expanse. The aftermath was measured, calm, reflective. The traveler approached carefully, brushing snow aside, observing the stillness of the fallen animal. The body, warm yet cooling against the snow, carried the scent of life and earth, a reminder of the cycles that governed all existence in these northern plains. Hands traced fur, felt muscle, and touched ice-encrusted snow, acknowledging the shared rhythm of life and survival. This was not triumph alone, but reflection, awareness of continuity, patience, and connection with the frozen land. Small tasks followed, preparing the animal for transport, ensuring that nothing was wasted, observing the subtle signs of weather, checking wind direction, and noting the surrounding terrain. Each action was slow, deliberate, and mindful, reinforcing the hypnotic rhythm of the north. The traveler reflected on the interconnectedness of life, on the balance between hunter and hunted, on the subtle messages carried by wind, snow, and river. Each moment, repeated and observed, became a meditation, a quiet acknowledgement of endurance and harmony. As the day progressed, shadows lengthened across snow and ice. The wind shifted gently, carrying faint scents from distant ridges and riverbanks. The traveler rested for a moment, eyes tracing the subtle contours of the plains, the ripples of snowdrifts, and the distant cliffs etched with frost. Reflection deepened. The hunt was not merely about sustenance, but about patience, rhythm, awareness, and reverence. Each repetition, each observation, each measured step mirrored the enduring patterns of life in the frozen north. Evening descended slowly. The traveler moved steadily, carrying the spoils of survival back toward temporary shelter. Each step was deliberate, echoing the rhythms of the day: observation, care, mindfulness, and repetition. The wind whispered across snow, the river murmured faintly in the distance, and the plains, vast and silent, seemed to hum with the continuity of countless lives, human and animal, woven together across generations. The hunt, in its slow, deliberate unfolding, became more than survival. It was meditation. It was reflection on cycles of life, endurance, and the quiet persistence of all living things. The frozen north, vast and unyielding, continued to teach through wind, snow, and movement. And as the traveler moved forward step by step, there was a profound awareness. Life persisted here, always measured, always observed, always respected, and always intertwined with the eternal rhythms of ice, wind, and snow. As the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, the traveler sought the solace of shelter among a sparse cluster of pines. Their needles, dark green against the snow, clung stubbornly despite the frost, glistening faintly as the light caught tiny beads of melting ice. The trees, though few, offered a muted sense of protection, a buffer against the relentless wind that swept across the frozen plains. The traveler moved slowly, carefully brushing snow from lower branches and scanning the ground for uneven ice or hidden driftwood. Each step was deliberate, measured, echoing the rhythm of the day. Observe, move, pause, breathe, and reflect. The shelter itself was simple. Driftwood collected from the riverbank, a few sturdy branches pried from the sparse trees, and layers of fur and moss composed a makeshift structure, hollowed to shield from wind and cold. The traveler arranged each piece with care, noting the weight, texture, and fit. The cold was ever present, biting at exposed skin and settling into gloves and boots, yet there was a subtle comfort in the process. The act of building, of preparing, became both practical and meditative, a quiet communion with the frozen land. Fingers brushed moss, feeling the softness beneath rough bark. Furs were folded, overlapping like ripples frozen in motion, and the wood, cold and rigid, offered stability in the otherwise shifting environment. Inside the shelter, the smell of pine mingled with the earthy scent of frozen moss and the faint metallic tang of iron-rich water from nearby rivers. The traveler settled on a layer of furs, adjusting posture to retain warmth while feeling the cold press against exposed joints. A small fire was kindled, sparks flaring briefly before catching, curling smoke rising gently and blending with the crisp air. The sound of crackling wood, subtle and measured, echoed softly against the shelter walls, a gentle companion to the rhythmic whisper of the wind outside. Each flicker of light played across snow-laden branches, reflecting in glimmers upon icicles that hung like fragile stalactites from shelter edges. The traveler paused, closing eyes briefly, letting warmth seep in, allowing muscles, previously tense from long movement, to relax. Breath slowed, inhalations drawing in scents of wood smoke, pine, and the faint taste of frost on the tongue. The mind wandered, contemplating the simplicity and fragility of shelter in this vast expanse. Survival here required attention to minutiae, the correct layering of furs, the precise positioning of driftwood, the subtle adjustment of the fire to provide warmth without consuming too much fuel. Each detail became an exercise in mindfulness, repetition reinforcing both necessity and ritual. Outside, the wind pressed against the shelter's outer branches, carrying whispers of distant cliffs, frozen rivers, and snow-laden ridges. Tiny flurries drifted inside openings, dusting furs with soft crystals that melted slowly against skin. The traveler observed, inhaled, and reflected. The north demanded awareness. Here, nothing could be taken for granted. The faintest miscalculation could result in exposure, discomfort, or worse. And yet there was beauty in the repetition, the slow, deliberate care required to survive and thrive. Each action, repeated daily across generations, was a testament to endurance and subtle artistry, the art of living in rhythm with the frozen land. The fire sputtered, sending a brief glow across the shelter's interior. Shadows stretched and shifted along walls of driftwood and fir, creating miniature landscapes that mirrored the world outside, peaks, valleys, and gentle slopes frozen in time. The traveler traced these shadows with fingers, noting each curve, each irregularity. There was a hypnotic quality to this motion, a rhythm that mirrored breathing, heartbeats, and the soft sighing of wind beyond the trees. Every detail, observed slowly, became a meditation on presence, patience, and continuity. A small pile of dried berries and roots, gathered during previous travels, sat beside the traveler. Fingers brushed over the rough surfaces, nodding the faint sweetness and scent, the resilience of preserved life, the connection to seasons past. Each bite, slow and deliberate, offered not only sustenance but a tactile meditation. The texture against teeth, the faint crunch of frozen residue, the warming effect as sugar mingled with cold-bitten fingers. Eating became a reflection on endurance, continuity, and the subtle artistry of living in a harsh, frozen world. The traveler's mind drifted to the cycles of life here. Shelter, like the river or the wind, followed a rhythm. Each day required attention, observation, and adaptation. Humans, animals, and even trees adjusted their movements and growth in response to the frozen land. Seasons imposed a steady repetition. Snow would fall, rivers would freeze, ice would crack and melt, and life would persist, measured in small, deliberate actions. The shelter was a microcosm of this broader rhythm, constructed carefully, maintained thoughtfully, respected consistently. It was a place of pause, reflection, and gentle repetition, echoing the patterns of survival etched into every snowdrift and riverbank. The wind outside rose, carrying the faint calls of distant creatures, a bird, perhaps a wolf, or the soft shifting of a herd crossing a nearby ridge. The traveler leaned forward, listening, allowing the sounds to fill the mind and body. Each note, each sigh, each distant rumble was absorbed slowly, reinforcing a sense of presence. Here, every sound was meaningful, every subtle change in wind, snow, or movement a message to be interpreted, integrated, and respected. Life persisted in patterns, and awareness of these patterns was a form of meditation as much as survival. The traveler's gaze returned to the shelter itself. Each branch, each layer of moss and fur, each spark of firelight was observed, appreciated, and noted. The repetitive tasks of maintaining warmth and comfort were not burdens but rituals, anchoring the mind to the present. Attention to detail became a rhythm, a quiet heartbeat mirroring the wider world. Ice shifting, snow settling, wind moving steadily across plains. There was calm in this repetition, reassurance in knowing that careful observation and deliberate action yielded stability and comfort, however fleeting it might be. Time flowed slowly inside the shelter. Shadows lengthened with the sun's descent, softening the edges of the space. The traveler lay back, hands resting on furs, eyes tracing cracks and knots in the driftwood ceiling, listening to the fire's occasional pop. Thoughts wandered to those who had built similar shelters in centuries past, their patience, their attentiveness, their quiet understanding of the rhythms that governed the frozen north. There was a sense of kinship across time, a gentle repetition of survival practices that connected generations in the shared art of observation, endurance, and reverence for the land. A distant river murmured faintly, carrying water beneath a thin layer of ice, a subtle companion to the fire's warmth and the whispering wind. The traveler closed eyes, letting the mind drift in tandem with these patterns. Step by step, sound by sound, breath by breath, the rhythm of life unfolded softly, echoing the gentle repetition of tasks, the subtle awareness of environment, the hypnotic cadence of the north. Each sensation, internal and external, reinforced presence and connection. As evening deepened, the traveler added a final log to the fire, watching sparks spiral into the darkening sky. Fingers traced edges of furs and moss once more, lingering on textures that would otherwise fade into night. There was a quiet understanding. The shelter, like the river, like the snow, like the wind, was part of a larger rhythm, a microcosm of persistence, adaptation, and continuity. Each gesture, repeated daily across countless generations, was an echo of survival and reflection in a frozen world. Night settled fully, the fire casting long shadows across walls of driftwood and fir. The wind hummed softly through the pine needles, and the traveler closed eyes, breathing in scents of smoke, pine, and frost. Each breath, each heartbeat, each gentle crackle of wood reinforced the hypnotic rhythm of existence in the north. Here, amidst snow and ice, wind and warmth, life persisted through attention, repetition, and quiet reflection. The shelter was more than protection. It was a space for meditation, an anchor in the vast expanse, a reminder that presence, patience, and care were as vital as warmth or sustenance. And so, within the humble structure nestled among frost-laden pines, the traveler rested, observing, reflecting, breathing, and listening. The frozen north whispered its lessons. Every wind gust, every crackle of ice, every distant river current carried meaning. In the gentle repetition of tending fire, arranging furs, and observing surroundings, the traveler became part of a timeless rhythm, one that connected all life, past and present, to the enduring, quiet pulse of a frozen world. Morning arrived quietly in the frozen north, the pale light of dawn spreading across the landscape like a thin veil. Snow shimmered softly, disturbed only by the faint traces of last night's wind, which had sculpted small ridges and ripples across the plains. The shelter among the pines offered protection, but now the traveler needed to move, following a narrow forest path that twisted between trees and snow-laden rocks. The path itself was subtle, almost hidden beneath a layer of powdery frost, yet discernible to eyes attuned to the gentle rhythms of the land. Each step required attention. The snow varied in texture, sometimes powdery, sometimes crusted over hidden ice, demanding careful placement to avoid slipping or disturbing fragile snow bridges over shallow creeks. The forest was quiet but alive in ways both subtle and profound. Tiny flakes of ice clung to pine needles, catching the weak sunlight and scattering it in muted prisms. The wind whispered through branches, bending them slightly and releasing soft showers of frozen dust that drifted lazily to the ground. Birds, small and cautious, flitted between tree trunks, their calls muffled by the snow. Occasionally, a squirrel or hare would break cover, leaving a fleeting trail of movement before disappearing again into the brush. Every sound was measured, every movement deliberate, a meditation on the subtle pulse of life that persisted even amidst the harsh cold. The traveler moved slowly, each step synchronized with breath and thought. The mind wandered, reflecting on the lessons of the plains, the river, and the shelter. Survival in this frozen environment was an intricate dance. One had to observe the patterns of wind, the texture of snow, the behavior of animals, and the subtle inclinations of terrain. Each detail mattered, each choice could carry consequences. Here, in the narrow path between snow-laden trees, the traveler was not just moving through space but participating in the ongoing rhythm of the forest, its winds, its shadows, its frozen stillness. The forest itself seemed to breathe. Snow-laden branches flexed under the slightest pressure, creaking faintly, while distant trees emitted soft cracks as ice shifted in response to warming light. A faint, persistent murmur came from a small creek running beneath a thin layer of ice, its water flowing patiently, persistently, quietly beneath a fragile crust. The traveler paused, kneeling to brush snow from the creek's edge, watching the dark water swirl and catch fragments of reflected sky. Fingers traced the frozen rim, feeling its texture, hard, brittle, yet smooth in parts where ice had melted and refrozen. Each sensation anchored the mind to the present, reinforcing awareness and continuity. Along the path, impressions in the snow hinted at past travelers, animal and human alike. A fox's tracks meandered delicately between tree trunks, small and precise, following the contours of roots and rocks. A hare had paused briefly, leaving the faint indent of paws pressed together before bounding onward. The traveler studied each print, imagining the life behind it. The soft padding of fur, the subtle movements of body, the way wind and snow had subtly altered the impressions over hours or days. Observation here was both survival and meditation, a practice repeated across countless generations, teaching patience, presence, and respect for the natural world. The traveler's thoughts drifted to ancestors who had walked similar paths, relying on observation, instinct, and knowledge of the land. Their movements were deliberate, measured, guided by rhythm and repetition, following game trails, reading snow, feeling the bite of wind, noting the subtle inclination of slopes. Each act carried practical purpose, but also offered time for reflection. The mind could wander in tandem with body, contemplating the interconnectedness of life, the passage of seasons, and the persistence of living beings despite the cold, harsh environment. A gust of wind swept through the forest, stirring loose snow from the upper branches. Tiny crystals swirled in the air, drifting lazily down like confetti. The traveler paused, letting the spectacle play across vision and fingers as some flakes settled on gloved hands and furs. The sensation was ephemeral. The snow melted slowly, releasing a faint, crisp scent of ice and pine. There was a hypnotic quality to the movement, echoing the gentle rhythm of breath and heartbeat, reinforcing a sense of presence in the frozen forest. Further along the path, the traveler encountered a fallen tree, its trunk partially buried in snow. Moss and frost clung to its bark, creating a textured tapestry of green, white, and brown. Kneeling to examine it, the traveler ran fingers over the rough surface, noting how ice had crystallized in tiny filaments, curling along grooves and ridges. A faint scratch suggested the passage of small animals, squirrels or birds perhaps, who had used the fallen tree as shelter or observation post. Every detail spoke of life persisting quietly, adapting to the harsh environment, moving through hidden channels of survival. The forest path narrowed, guiding the traveler between steep inclines and low valleys where snow had drifted in deeper layers. Steps became more deliberate, muscles engaged in careful balance, eyes scanning for obstacles, animal tracks, or subtle shifts in terrain. Every movement required full attention, but this attentiveness also allowed the mind to wander, imagining life cycles of the forest, the small dramas of prey and predator, the gentle unfolding of seasons across centuries. The rhythm of walking mirrored the rhythm of life itself, measured in observation, adaptation, and mindful repetition. Occasionally, the traveler paused to drink from the creek or to nibble on dried berries kept in a small pouch. Each bite, each sip was deliberate, the cold water bracing yet refreshing, the berries offering subtle sweetness against the otherwise muted palette of flavors in the snowbound forest. The act of nourishment became a meditation, a repeated ritual reinforcing awareness of body, environment, and continuity. Eating slowly, feeling the textures, tasting the faint earthy tones carried from the land itself, the traveler became further attuned to the subtle pulse of life surrounding them. The day deepened, the light shifting through the branches, casting long shadows across the snow. The traveler's attention lingered on these moving patterns, shadows stretching, bending, overlapping with snow drifts and rocks. The forest, though frozen and seemingly still, was full of rhythm, cycles of light, sound, and movement unfolding slowly yet perceptibly. Each shadow, each glimmer of ice, each rustle of branch or leaf whispered stories of life, endurance, and adaptation. The traveler absorbed these rhythms, allowing the senses to align with the quiet pulse of the forest. By mid-afternoon, the traveler noticed subtle signs of larger animals, tracks of a reindeer herd that had passed through the forest days earlier. The prints were partially obscured by wind and drifting snow, yet discernible enough to indicate direction, spacing, and the pace of movement. The traveler knelt to study them, tracing shapes with fingers, imagining the soft crunch of hooves, the gentle swaying of heads as animals moved in rhythm. The mind reflected on continuity, humans and animals alike moving in patterns dictated by the land, by the seasons, by survival. Each step echoed the lessons of observation, repetition, and patience passed down across generations. The forest, with its muted sounds and subtle textures, offered a profound sense of connection. The traveler walked slowly, mindful of each step, breath aligned with movement, thoughts wandering yet tethered to immediate perception. Moss, ice, snow, and wind became companions, teaching patience and attentiveness. The rhythmic repetition of walking, pausing, observing, and reflecting reinforced a hypnotic cadence, grounding the traveler in the frozen north's quiet, enduring pulse. As evening approached, light softened, scattering across ice-coated branches and snow-covered rocks. The traveler paused at a gentle rise in the path, looking out over a valley where the forest thinned and the distant river glimmered faintly in muted reflection. The air carried subtle scents, wet moss, cold stone, and faint traces of animals that had passed unseen. The mind lingered, reflecting on patterns of movement, cycles of life, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of days in this frozen expanse. Presence became meditation, observation became reflection, and the path itself became a teacher, echoing centuries of quiet endurance and awareness. With the approach of night, the traveler settled near a group of sturdy pines, preparing to rest for the coming hours. Hands brushed snow aside, arranging furs for warmth, listening to the distant murmur of water and the whisper of wind through needles. Shadows deepened, sounds softened, and the forest's hypnotic rhythm carried the traveler into contemplation. The interconnectedness of life, the subtle lessons of survival, the quiet persistence of the North. Each breath, each heartbeat, each careful movement became part of an unbroken cadence that had existed long before and would continue long after, linking the present moment to the timeless, frozen world. The final day began in muted gold, the sun rising slowly over the frozen horizon, brushing frost-laden branches and snow-dusted rocks with delicate light. The traveler paused atop a gentle rise, breathing in the crisp air, letting the cold sting of morning fill the lungs and awaken every sense. Each inhalation carried the faint aroma of pine, the metallic tang of distant ice, and the earthy scent of snow-covered soil. The landscape stretched outward, a vast canvas of white punctuated by dark ridges, frozen rivers glinting in the pale sunlight, and scattered clusters of resilient trees. The north, vast and silent, seemed to breathe along with the traveler, its rhythm slow, deliberate, and eternal. Movement resumed, step by measured step, along a ridge that overlooked a distant valley. Snow crunched under boots in a steady cadence, echoing faintly across slopes and hollows. Every sound, every shadow, every subtle shift in light was observed and absorbed. The traveler paused often, listening for the soft murmur of distant water, the faint crack of ice under the warming sun, the whisper of wind moving through skeletal trees. In these pauses, the mind wandered through centuries, the countless travelers, hunters, and animals who had navigated these plains, leaving faint traces in snow, ice, and memory. Presence and reflection intertwined, forming a quiet meditation on continuity, survival, and the persistence of life in the frozen north. A river appeared below, winding like a dark ribbon through the valley. Its surface, partially frozen, shimmered with slow movement beneath patches of ice. The traveler descended carefully, mindful of footing on snow-crusted slopes and hidden ice. Each step was deliberate, echoing the measured rhythm of the river itself. Flow, pause, ripple, flow. Kneeling at the water's edge, gloved fingers brushed the surface, feeling the ice's brittle edge and the cool current beneath. A single droplet was tasted, a ritual repeated over days, and its freshness carried a subtle lesson of continuity. Life persisted, quietly, patiently, beautifully. Nearby, faint tracks caught the traveler's attention. A hare had passed this way during the night, its small, careful steps a delicate signature in the snow. Beyond them, larger prints suggested a fox, prowling silently in search of food, each paw imprint precise, deliberate, yet fleeting. The traveler traced them slowly, reflecting on the hidden life that thrived in this harsh environment. Observation had become a meditation. Every trace, every subtle movement, every sound carried lessons in survival, attentiveness, and humility before the frozen land. As the day wore on, clouds drifted lazily across the pale sky, casting soft shadows that shifted slowly over snow and ice. The traveler paused atop another ridge, scanning the horizon. Distant cliffs glimmered faintly, their jagged edges softened by frost. The river below twisted in gentle curves, sunlight glinting off ice like scattered jewels. Farther still, the forest thinned, revealing rolling plains that seemed endless. There was quiet awe in this view, a profound understanding of scale and time. The land had endured for millennia, sculpted by wind, ice, and water, and life had persisted alongside it, measured in slow rhythms, subtle patterns, and repetition. The traveler settled briefly, sitting on a rock dusted with snow, letting the senses absorb every detail. Fingers brushed icy ridges, feeling texture and cold. Eyes traced the curves of the river and the shifting light across distant ridges. Ears tuned to the faint sigh of wind, the distant drip of melting ice, the subtle murmur of life moving unseen. Breath slowed, heart rate steadied, and for a few hours the body and mind synchronized with the vast rhythm of the north. Each inhalation and exhalation mirrored the gentle pulse of wind, river, and forest, reinforcing the hypnotic cadence of life in this frozen world. A sudden movement caught the traveler's eye, a small herd of caribou crossing the distant plains, moving with careful, deliberate steps. Their hooves pressed into the snow, leaving rhythmic patterns that echoed faintly in memory and imagination. The traveler observed closely, noting posture, packing, and interaction among the animals. Every tilt of head, flick of ear, or pause in movement became a lesson in endurance and awareness. Life here thrived through rhythm, observation, and patience. The caribou exemplified survival in its quietest, most measured form. The sun shifted slowly toward evening, scattering golden light across snow and ice. Shadows lengthened, stretching along ridges, bending over rocks, and weaving through trees. The traveler's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the journey. The river's patient whispers, the careful tracing of tracks, the measured hunt, the shelter among pines, the rhythmic path through the forest. Each chapter of the day, each repetition, each act of observation and mindfulness had been both survival and meditation, a slow unfolding of life in harmony with the frozen land. The traveler continued along the ridge, now descending toward a gentle valley where the river widened and ice shimmered like fractured glass. Fingers traced snow ridges and icy stones along the way, feeling textures and temperatures with deliberate care. The wind carried distant scents, wet earth, pine, and faint hints of animal life. Each inhalation reinforced connection to the environment. Each step mirrored centuries of human and animal movement across this terrain. Observation, reflection, and rhythm remained central. Life here required patience, attention, and a deep awareness of the subtleties of the north. By late afternoon, the traveler paused at a final vantage point, overlooking a panorama that stretched to the horizon. Ice-capped ridges, forests dusted with snow, rivers twisting through valleys, all combined in a vast, silent tableau of endurance. A gentle wind carried whispers across the landscape, brushing against cheeks, rustling pine needles and stirring tiny snowflakes into spiraling dances. The traveler inhaled deeply, letting the air, scent, and silence settle into body and mind. This place, vast yet intimate in its subtle details, embodied the lessons of the journey: persistence, patience, attentiveness, and the quiet beauty of life moving in rhythm with the frozen land. As dusk fell, the travelers settled among low rocks near the riverbank, arranging furs and driftwood for warmth. A small fire flickered, its soft crackle a gentle companion to the whispering wind and flowing water. Shadows danced across snow and ice, echoing shapes of distant ridges and trees. The traveler's mind wandered across the journey. The river's gentle murmur, the tracks in snow, the careful hunt, the shelter among pines, the winding forest path, and now this final vista. Each chapter had been a meditation in presence and continuity, each moment a lesson in the subtle rhythms of survival and reflection. Stars began to appear overhead, pale at first, then brightening as night deepened. The traveler lay back on furs, gazing upward, noticing constellations mirrored faintly in the glint of ice and snow. Breath slowed, the heart followed the gentle rhythm of night, and the mind drifted in sync with the eternal cadence of the north. There was a quiet understanding. Life, though fleeting and fragile, persisted through attention, patience, and care. The wind, the river, the snow, the forest, and the animals all moved in patterns that had existed for centuries and would continue for centuries more. The traveler's final thoughts lingered on connection and continuity. Each step along the frozen plains, each careful observation, each small act of survival had been part of a greater pattern. The North was harsh and indifferent, yet profoundly instructive. It demanded awareness, rewarded patience, and revealed subtle beauty to those who moved slowly and observed carefully. Life here was measured in rhythm and repetition, in breath, movement, and reflection. Each moment fully inhabited became a meditation on persistence, adaptation, and the gentle endurance of all living things. Night deepened fully. The fire flickered low, wind whispered through distant ridges, and the river murmured beneath ice. The traveler closed eyes, letting the rhythms of the land, the history of the plains, and the persistence of life wash over consciousness. Sleep approached gently, carried on the pulse of wind, snow, and water as the frozen north hummed quietly around, timeless, eternal, patient, and serene. And in that stillness, the journey reached its quiet conclusion. Every lesson, every observation, every act of survival and reflection became part of the traveler, woven into the mind, body, and spirit. Life in the frozen north, though challenging, revealed its secrets to those who moved slowly, observed deeply, and allowed themselves to become one with its eternal, hypnotic rhythm. The horizon stretched endlessly, silent yet alive, and the traveler rested within it, connected to generations past, present, and future, immersed fully in the enduring, quiet heartbeat of the North.